You've met someone who was completely certain of something that wasn't true. Maybe they misremembered an argument. Maybe they swore a conversation happened one way when it happened another. Maybe they were so convinced of their own version of events that no amount of evidence could shake them. You probably filed that away as a flaw. Something wrong with them. Something you don't do. But here's the uncomfortable question this video is going to sit with for the next few minutes. What if that isn't a flaw at all? What if it's just how brains work? All of them, including yours. There's a researcher named Neil Seth who studies consciousness, and he describes perception using a strange phrase. He calls it a controlled hallucination. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, an actual working description of what your brain does every waking second. Your brain never receives reality directly. It receives fragments, light hitting your retina, vibrations hitting your eardrum, chemical signals drifting into your nose. From those fragments, it builds a guess, a prediction, a best fit model of what's probably out there. Most of the time, that guess lines up closely enough with the world that you never notice the gap. But closely enough is not the same as perfectly. And that gap, the small distance between what your brain constructs and what's actually true, never fully closes. Not for anyone. Not ever. So here's the real thesis of this video. Sanity was never a switch. It was never a line with healthy minds on one side and broken minds on the other. Sanity is a spectrum, and everyone without exception has a position somewhere on it. Start small. Start with something you've probably experienced yourself. You're mid-conversation with someone close to you, and they say something that stops you cold. That's not what happened. You were there. You remember it clearly. And yet, they remember it just as clearly, just differently. One of you is wrong, possibly both of you. A researcher named Elizabeth Loftus spent decades studying exactly this. She's one of the most cited psychologists alive, largely because of one unsettling finding, repeated in study after study. Memory doesn't work like a recording. It works like a reconstruction. Every time you recall something, your brain rebuilds it from fragments, and every rebuild is an opportunity for small distortions to creep in. In some of her most famous experiments, Loftus showed that people could be led to remember entire events that never happened. Getting lost in a mall as a child, being attacked by an animal, details, emotions, even embarrassment, all constructed around a memory with no factual foundation at all. The unsettling part isn't that this happens to some people, it's that it happens to almost everyone, and almost none of them can tell the difference from the inside. Think about that. A false memory doesn't feel false. It feels exactly as real, exactly as certain as a true one. Which means right now, somewhere in your own memory, there is very likely a detail, a conversation, a childhood moment that didn't happen quite the way you remember it, and you have no reliable way to know which one it is. That's drift number one. Small, constant, and invisible from the inside. Push a little further along the spectrum. You've had a moment of déjà vu, that eerie sensation that you've lived this exact second before. Nothing supernatural is happening. Your brain's timing has briefly misfired, tagging a brand new experience with the label of a memory, a glitch in the translation process. Nothing more. But notice something important. In the moment it happens, it doesn't feel like a glitch. It feels like certainty. It feels like knowledge. Now think about grief. Roughly half of people who lose a spouse report at some point afterward hearing that person's voice or briefly seeing them in a room or feeling their presence beside them. Half. That is not a rare clinical event. That is closer to a normal feature of human grief. The brain, so finely tuned to predict the presence of someone it modeled for years, keeps generating that prediction even after the input that built it is gone. The hallucination isn't a malfunction. It's a highly functioning brain doing exactly what it always does, just working from an outdated model. Ask yourself something. If the majority of grieving humans experience a genuine sensory hallucination and it is quietly considered a normal part of loss, doesn't that already prove sanity was never a hard line? Push further again. You're exhausted, not tired, genuinely sleep-deprived, the kind of exhaustion that comes after staying awake for a day and a half or more. At that point, Otherwise healthy people begin reporting things that sound almost clinical. Shadows that seem to move, distrust of people they normally trust completely. In extended sleep deprivation studies, some participants have described full paranoid episodes, convinced that researchers were plotting against them, based on nothing but exhaustion. Give the exact same brain that watched this video calmly right now, enough sleep deprivation, and it will start generating experiences clinically indistinguishable from psychosis. Not a different kind of brain, the same one, pushed further along the same spectrum. So where exactly is the line supposed to be? Here's a strange place to look for an answer. Not a hospital, a courtroom. You've probably heard the phrase, "not guilty by reason of insanity," in a movie or a news headline, tossed around like it's simple. Like there's a clean legal box marked sane and another marked insane, and a judge just decides which one someone belongs in. The reality is stranger than that, and far messier. In most courtrooms, the legal test for insanity traces back to a rule from 1843, named after a man called Daniel Manacton, who was tried for killing a British official under the delusion that he was being hunted by a political conspiracy. The rule that emerged from his trial asks a very narrow question. Not is this person mentally ill, something much stricter. At the moment of the act, did the person understand the difference between right and wrong? Notice what that leaves out. Someone can be diagnosed with a severe, well-documented psychiatric condition, hearing voices, experiencing delusions, and still be found legally sane, simply because some part of them understood that the act was against the law. The legal line and the clinical line were never the same line at all. And here's the detail that surprises almost everyone. The insanity defense, the one dramatized constantly in films and television, is used in barely 1 out of every 100 criminal cases in the United States, and succeeds in only a small fraction of those. It is one of the rarest defenses in the entire legal system, not because insanity is rare, but because proving it, in the narrow legal sense, is extraordinarily difficult. Which means the courtroom, the one place society has tried hardest to draw a hard, official line between sane and insane, couldn't actually do it either. It could only draw a line for a single narrow legal question, understanding right from wrong, and even that line moves depending on the country, the century, and the case. If lawyers, doctors, and judges spending centuries on this exact question still can't agree on a fixed boundary, that should tell you something. The boundary was never hiding somewhere, waiting to be found precisely. It was never there to begin with. There isn't a clean answer, and that's the point. There was never a wall separating sanity from madness. There is only distance. Distance between what a brain is constructing and what would actually help that person navigate the world. Now go to the far end of the spectrum, the end most people think about when they hear the word insanity. Psychosis, schizophrenia spectrum experiences, full sustained hallucinations, unshakable beliefs that don't respond to evidence. The neurologist Oliver Sacks spent a career documenting cases at exactly this end of the spectrum, and one thing runs through nearly all of his case studies. The brain wasn't producing nonsense. It was producing meaning, coherent, structured, deeply felt meaning, built from broken or overactive prediction systems. Patients weren't experiencing randomness. They were experiencing an alternative, internally consistent model of reality, one that had drifted far enough from the shared model that the outside world called it illness. There's another case worth knowing. A woman named Eleanor Longden began hearing voices in her mind as a young adult. Voices that eventually narrated her actions and criticized her constantly. By the clinical definition, this placed her firmly in the territory of severe mental illness. But here's what makes her story matter for this video. Years later, working with the right support, she came to understand those voices not as invaders, but as fragmented expressions of her own suppressed emotions, given a form her brain could process. The extreme end of the spectrum and the ordinary end weren't different in kind. They were built from the exact same architecture, prediction, emotion, memory, just running further from consensus. And under far more pressure. Which brings up an uncomfortable question. If perception is always a construction, and memory is always a reconstruction, and grief can produce hallucinations in half the population, and exhaustion alone can produce paranoia in a normal brain, then what precisely does sanity mean? Here's the most useful answer available. Sanity isn't measured by whether your brain constructs a model of reality. Every brain does that, always, with no exceptions. Sanity is measured by how far that construction drifts from two things at once, how close it stays to the physical world, and how closely it stays aligned with everyone else's construction. That second part matters more than most people realize. Because reality alone was never the only test. Shared reality is the other half of the equation, and shared reality is stranger than it sounds. Money isn't a physical fact of the universe. It's a hallucination that several billion humans happen to agree on simultaneously. Borders between nations aren't visible from space. Laws exist nowhere except inside minds, and the paper minds agreed to write them on. None of these things are real in the way a rock or a river is real. They are constructions, exactly like the redness of an apple or the solidity of a table, except this time the construction is collective instead of individual. And that raises something genuinely unsettling. If enough people share the same distorted belief at the same time, it stops being called a delusion and starts being called culture. History has entire chapters built on this. In 1692, an entire town became convinced that neighbors, sometimes close friends, were secretly practicing witchcraft, and acted on that belief with lethal certainty. In the Middle Ages, one of the strangest recorded events, sometimes called the Dancing Plague, saw dozens of people in a single town compelled to dance uncontrollably for days, seemingly infected by nothing more than the belief spreading person to person. None of the individuals in these events were uniquely broken. They were ordinary brains, running the same prediction machinery you're running right now, synchronized around a shared distortion instead of an individual one. Which means the line between sanity and delusion was never really about truth at all. It was about consensus. Not even a courtroom, built entirely around answering this one question, could draw it any more precisely than that. You are not measured against reality itself. Almost nobody has direct access to that. You are measured against how closely your internal model lines up with the models running inside everyone around you. That should change how you think about your own certainty. Right now, today, you carry beliefs you consider completely obvious, completely sane, completely beyond question. Some of them are accurate reflections of the world. Some of them, quietly, are not. You have no internal alarm that rings differently for the two. A false memory feels exactly like a true one. A biased judgment feels exactly like a fair one. A shared cultural assumption feels exactly like an objective fact. The only real difference between you and someone diagnosed as unwell is not whether your brain constructs reality. It always does. The difference is distance and direction, and whether enough people happen to be standing on the same point of the spectrum as you. So go back to that moment at the beginning. Someone's certain of something that wasn't true. You probably still think that's not you. But remember the eyewitnesses who misremembered a car, positive they'd seen it correctly. Remember the grieving widow certain she heard her husband's footsteps. Remember the exhausted ordinary mind convinced, just for one exhausted night, that people it trusted were plotting against it. Remember that even the legal system, built by careful minds across nearly 2 centuries specifically to answer this question, still can't draw the line any sharper than a blur. None of them were broken machines. They were the same machine you're using right now, running the same process, just pushed slightly further along the same continuum you're standing on at this very moment. We are all delusional, to some extent. The only real question left is not whether that's true of you, it's how far along the line you happen to be standing today, and how far you'll drift tomorrow without ever noticing you moved. If you watched this video up till this point, it probably means you enjoy learning about human biology, psychology, and evolution. Follow this channel to support it and keep videos like this showing up in your feed. And if you've ever remembered an argument completely differently than the other person did, tell it in the comments. Your brain might be doing something more ordinary than you think.